like to commence, though, the seminar by just acknowledging that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Widjabul-Waible people of the Bundjalung Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and also to acknowledge Indigenous people, or Aboriginal people in the room today. I'm Jodie Bailey and I'm a research fellow here, and I have the privilege of working with James and Natalie. These seminar series are a collaboration. They're a collaboration with us, the University Centre for Rural Health, Southern Cross University, the local health district and the Primary Health Network. So we run these seminars every month and we have a broad range of topics. But these seminars wouldn't be possible without people like Natalie and James that are willing to do presentations, and also thanks to Holly for all of her work in organising these events. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. As you know, tea and coffee is available, so we welcome you and encourage you to stay afterwards to mingle and discuss issues that have emerged afterwards, so we welcome people to stay on. The bathroom is just outside of the door here. You turn right and you turn right again, so the bathrooms are out there. The seminar is being recorded. We have a number of people that were unable to attend today that really wanted to hear the seminar, so we are recording this seminar. And just as you be aware, please make sure you turn off your phone. And we'll also just make sure that we allow plenty of question time at the end, because I'm quite sure this will be a topic that will evoke a lot of sort of questions, and so we'll make sure that there's question time at the end. Before I introduce Natalie and James, I would like to just mention that our next presentation is going to be by Kazi Raham from the North Coast Public Health Unit, very topical on the coronavirus, and he's going to do an epidemiological overview for us. So that's our next topic on the seminar series. So keep an eye out for that. Oh, I don't know, actually. It'll be in about a month's time. So we're going to try and send out the promotional material next week for that seminar. 16th of March. Oh, yes. Hi, we're performing here. So today, I haven't clicked through all these topics that you've very kindly... Oh, there you go. If I just followed... So Natalie is a Wiradjuri woman, and Natalie holds a Masters of Clinical Psychology from the University of Queensland. Natalie has been recently appointed to the position as a group facilitator and researcher on the project that you'll hear more about today. James Bennett-Levy is a Professor of Mental Health and Psychological Wellbeing, also based here at the UCRH. He has published widely in his specialist area, and more recently has focused his research attention on Aboriginal social and emotional wellbeing. Natalie and James have collaborated on various projects since 2009, including the pilot project, which was in 2017 to 18, that has informed the project that we'll be hearing more about today. So it sounds like a long collaboration. So I welcome Natalie. Thank you, Natalie.
That's all right. Thanks, Jodie. Can everyone hear me okay? I've got a quiet voice, so if you need me to speak louder or yell, just let me know. So before we begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Widjabul-Waible people of the Bundjalung Nation. I want to pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and also extend that on to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. What our presentation will focus on today is largely the pilot study that we did in 2017 and 18. So we'll take you through, I guess, the process or the journey that we kind of went on over the year. I'd also like to acknowledge the partnering services that were involved in the project. So Namatjira Haven, Bunjum Corporation, Wollona AMS, and Rekindling the Spirit. Also, overseeing the project, we had an advisory group, and we also presented at the Nyungai Health Council. And of course, Sunita, who's over here today, our collaborator from Real Artworks, and Michael Phelps, who was also involved in the pilot project. The pilot project was funded by the Primary Health Network. And I also want to acknowledge the health professionals and, of course, the clients that participated in the pilot study. So compassion-focused therapy was developed by Professor Paul Gilbert in 2000. At the time, Paul was working with lots of clients that had high levels of shame and self-criticism, and what he was finding was that traditional therapies like cognitive behaviour therapy were not working. I guess the reason why those therapies weren't working were people were able to kind of cognitively understand some of the concepts, but didn't have that felt sense of experience. So what he went on to develop was CFT, and really the focus of that was to build the skills of compassion, and compassion is very much the antidote to shame. And it's also growing, CFT is actually growing a large evidence base. So there's lots of research being done in this space at the moment, which is very exciting. So the definition of compassion, it's the sensitivity to suffering and motivating, so having the motivation to alleviate it. So there's two parts of it. It's turning towards your suffering and actually doing something about it. And for self-compassion, it's bringing the seeds of kindness and courage to our own suffering and practicing that with a new skill. So I'll give you a bit of a personal example of that. Back in 19, last year, at the end of last year, I just started working on the project here, and it was at a time when everything was going wrong. My children were getting sick, my mother-in-law was getting sick, and the way that I kind of faced that and dealt with that was by getting really hard on myself. So thankfully, through the training that I've had with self-compassion, it was actually kind of recognizing that, hey, this is actually suffering, this is a hard time. So rather than kind of beating myself up and being highly critical about everything that was going wrong, I had a choice. I could take that path and it would lead to more suffering, or I could actually practice those skills of self-compassion and realize that this is suffering, it's okay, I'll get through it. So some of the underpinnings of CFT. So what CFT tells us is that when we experience hardship or negative life experiences and adversity, we can develop self-criticism. And when we develop self-criticism and experience that, it can lead to things like depression, anxiety, for some people drug and alcohol problems. And when we experience that, we actually experience higher levels of self-criticism. So it's a bit of a loop that occurs there. And of course, with self-criticism, for many people, it's experiencing feelings of shame, the feeling bad about themselves. So like I said earlier, self-compassion is very much an antidote to shame and criticism. And when we're able to develop self-compassion and have a self-understanding and self-empathy, we realise and come to understand that many of the things that we experience in our life aren't our fault. We don't have any choice around being born. We don't have any choice around the parents that we're given, genetic, the schools that we go to. There's so much in our lives that aren't our fault that we don't have any choice or say about. So when we develop self-compassion, self-understanding and self-empathy, and we realise that it's not our fault, we have a new way of relating to ourselves, a care for our own well-being. So in our pilot project, what we hoped to achieve was to build that sense of personal safeness for people, so actually having a new way of feeling safe and secure, bringing compassion and kindness to themselves, as well as being able to tolerate difficult emotions. So bringing skills such as mindfulness and distress tolerance. Our first round of groups were very much conventional groups. So if you see this picture here with everyone sitting around in a circle and on their chairs, that was very much the pilot project where we started from and then moved to arts. So in those first round of groups, what we kind of found was that traditional CFT wasn't working. So the reason perhaps why it wasn't working, it was largely cognitive based, so it's kind of people are in their head, and when we're doing experiential exercises, for some people they were quite triggering. So a lot of people in their groups, participants suggested, what about trialling arts? So we teamed up with community real artworks and moved from the conventional CFT to an arts-based CFT, which was 6 sessions, and James is going to talk about that now.
Thanks, Natalie. So, our arts-based CFT then, so what I'm going to actually report is a study now, turned into a pilot study essentially. So there are 10 participants plus us 2 who are very much participants. We'll talk about that a bit. In the group, I've helped them multiply clients, as you can see. And so we had, basically our process was this, that Natalie or I would introduce the topic of the day, which might be, what does safeness mean to you, or how do you represent self-compassion? And then we'd hand over to Sunita and Michael, who would facilitate the arts process for the next 3 hours or so. We'd have lunch, and as I said, Natalie and I were very much part of that, and so were the other health workers, and Charles here as well, who was very much involved with that one. And then the last 20, 30 minutes, we'd reflect on what we produced in terms of art, and kind of what it meant, and how that had related to the particular topic. And we had lots of materials. I can't tell you how much, but it's the most fun I've ever had in group. So we have, for those of us who do not consider ourselves as artists, wonderful having collage. I promise you. So we had collage, we had crayons and pastels, and an enormous mess with glitter and all the rest of it. And then afterwards, we printed up the cards from, Natalie's got the cards just there. So we printed up these cards, and you'll see many representations of the cards in the slides anyway, and gave everyone who was participant a set of the cards. So 1 to 3 months later, 2 people who weren't involved in the arts groups themselves, the psychologists, Leah Hidden, who worked here, and Stacey Edwards, who is doing a master's in clinical psychology, did interviews with 6 out of the 10 participants, and then we did a qualitative analysis of those interviews. And basically what we did then was code all the feedback from the participants, and then in the qualitative analysis what you're doing is you're kind of going up and up so that you get sort of overall concepts that describe the particular, well you'll see in a minute, but basically describing a particular experience. So this is what came out of it. So really you can think about when you're doing a program like this, there's two elements. There's the process element, which is how you're going along and what's happening as you're doing it. And then there's the outcomes, like what are the outcomes of participants at the end of the day. So So I'll focus on the process side of things to start with. And so there were two key things, two key upper order categories that came out. First of all, the facilitated group process. And secondly, the idea of art as a medium for the cultivation of compassion. So I'll give you just a couple of examples of these, the kind of things that people said. So one of them was, and there are many, many examples, these are just, a couple in each category. So there was no distinction between the facilitators and participants. So one of the things that would never have struck us to start with, but one of the things people loved was the non-hierarchical nature of this, that all of us were involved in the group. And so that kind of, it had a very different structure, say, to the groups we were doing before, the first set of groups we were doing in the circles, whereas, Natalie or I were facilitating the group and leading. And so here's another example. So when you hear other people's stories and you kind of like, oh, I can relate to that, it's good to know. We all know that we're not the only one that's feeling like that. But then to hear it from someone else, it makes you feel a bit of relief. So the whole group atmosphere, group process, really, that idea of common humanity, we are not alone, is pretty fundamental. Okay, art as a medium for compassion. This, I think, is a quote that really sums up what we mean by that. So the magic comes out of combining art with compassion-focused therapy. It was the way that it was done. You could always get some artist to come in, and you could always get a psychology professor dude, I think they were referring to me, to come up with a concept. That's quite special how it married together. And so what we would suggest is that art alone, or even art therapy alone, there's something that compassion-focused therapy was adding that's a little extra to the process, that adds, well, obviously that element of compassion, but that's what people were particularly relating to, the combination of the two. Okay, and back to Natalie now.
So James just focused on the process. In terms of outcomes, there were 4 outcomes that were really identified as key themes. So these were planting the seeds of new understanding. So that's understanding the rationale for compassion-focused therapy, embodying some of the skills of compassion, which both of those led to, or manifesting, strengthening relationships, so more positive relationships with others, and evolving a compassionate relationship with themselves. So we'll look at a few examples of those now. So being the eldest grandchild to my family of 15 aunties and uncles, and then I've got to nurture them, plus their children as well, it's a lot of pressure. They are so demanding for my time. I realised I am to look after number 1, me, instead of carrying the burden and looking after everyone else within my family. I've learnt to pull back. And another example is I pretty much didn't have compassion or self-compassion until I went and did that course. It has helped me into giving myself more compassion and stop putting myself down all the time. So it's helped. I thought of compassion for other people, but not for myself. So really, I think this is really important, particularly when in Aboriginal communities, there's that sense of responsibility for others, and it certainly can lead to burnout, not just for workers in communities, but also for community members. That having that kind of understanding of the rationale of self-compassion has really helped the participants to understand that it's okay to put their needs first, it's not selfish. The breathing techniques I've started to take on board. When I start feeling a bit of anxiety, I use my breathing techniques. It helps me to feel relaxed instead of being so hyperactive. And another example of embodying the skills of compassion is the way I look at being compassionate for myself is taking time out, even just to rest or even watch a TV show. So time out for me. So these are examples of what people are actually doing differently after actually learning some of the skills of compassion. So the breathing exercises are largely around slowing down, so activating that soothing system rather than being in threat. And the other example is actually a demonstration of compassionate behaviour, so doing something differently. Another example is when it's working out good, because now when my sisters know and other people know, I would drop everything if anything happened to the children, or even if my niece or nephew or friend was stuck in town, I would go down and pick them up and bring them home. But just knowing I can say no is okay without feeling guilty. And this is huge because often when we think about strengthening relationships with others, it's about, well, what can I do to actually make them happy? But when we're thinking about self-compassion, it's around our own needs and what's good for us in the way that it's okay to say no without feeling guilty. And another example is, well, usually I would just stay in bed and not do much at all, doing nothing really, and just be depressed. But since doing the course, I motivate myself now. Instead of just staying in bed, I get out in the garden or do some painting. Or do something creative to make myself feel better. So if you remember back to the definition of compassion, it's actually having a sensitivity towards your suffering. So in this case, it's actually understanding that, yes, I am depressed. I do have depressive symptoms, but it's actually having the motivation to alleviate it, so doing something different. And for this person, it's actually getting out in the garden or doing some painting.
So that's the data, as it were. So how do we explain, or how do we understand what's actually going on? So we want to talk about these two aspects of the process. So the facilitating of the group process in part as a medium for cultivation, compassion. So as far as facilitation of group process is concerned, so clearly one of the things that comes out strongest is that from the data is this sense of safeness that people felt profoundly safe in the group that was created, safe with each other, safe with us as facilitators. And that, part of that was, as he said, a very sort of non-hierarchical nature of the group. What happened in practice, which is vastly different to those first formalised groups, is there were all these informal conversations. So, twos and threes, and then sometimes the whole group. And we have music on as well in the background, people selecting music. But actually what was happening in the informal conversations was far more personal, far more sharing than in the, in those formal, traditional, as it were, groups that we'd run in the first part of the project that didn't work so well. And clearly another thing was happening was the fact that people were I'm not the only one who feels like this. Other people share this too. And so that sense of common humanity was really fundamental. We talk in compassion-focused therapy about the three flows of compassion. And we can think about what happened in groups in terms of these three flows as well. So clearly what was happening in the group was compassion for others. So people were sharing stories and bits that they felt compassion for others. But they also received compassion for others and felt that experience of receiving compassion for others. And as they experienced those two flows, so it's only natural that they start to move on to, okay, well, what about me and how I'm treating myself? And can I experience this flow of receiving compassion for myself? So hence we're starting to actually internalized self-compassion. So art is a medium for cultivation of compassion. So clearly, art does provide cultural resonance, and I think very well summed up here by this quote. That medium was really good. It was just a winner doing it that way. Anybody black, white, brindle would take to that way of delivering a program. In compassion-focused therapy, we also have this model called the three circles model. In a nutshell, there's the threat and protection system, that's that fight, flight, freeze that we experience when we experience threat. And then there's the drive system to orient towards goals and achievement. And then the other system we talk about is the soothing and connection system. So how we relate to our children, our dearest friends, our loved ones. And what we're doing in compassion-focused therapy, or what we're doing in arts-based compassion-focused therapy, is we're clearly engaging with that system. And again, that's vastly different if you think of a formalised, those round groups where we're probably engaging with people's threat systems. So, what does art do then? So art's slow, isn't it? Slows you right down. It's non-threatening. It's absorbing, it's fun, and it's single-focused, mindfulness. And the subject matter, the topic, is compassion. And as we said just before, it seems to be like this combination of art and compassion really makes quite a difference there. All right, so to sum up from the 2017-18 study, so clearly, it's a pilot study, no question. Data from qualitative data from 6 participants, and we clearly need to go bigger, and we will go bigger, which is really nice, as we'll talk to you about in a minute. One thing we learned was to listen, or relearn maybe, was just to make sure you listen really well to participants, in the process, and get the feedback from them and take that on board. And it was they who suggested, why don't you try art? We feel that the combination of an indigenous way of being and doing through art and sophisticated and I think very good Western psychotherapy is a very powerful combination. And good thing is that we've actually got funded for the next couple of years. I'll just hand over back to Natalie to tell you a bit about that, and after that we'll have questions.
Extremely exciting. While I was off having a baby at the end of 2018, James was looking for additional funding, and he was successful in getting some funding from the Department of Health. And the aims of that funding is really to extend and evaluate arts-based compassion-focused therapy. And the second aim is actually to train staff and hand over the program. So beyond the funding period, so what we want to do is have a training package and staff trained, so it actually stays within community and the organisations that we're working with. So as I said earlier, we kind of kicked off again in 2019 in October. We've got the 4 Aboriginal health services back on board, real artworks. We've had a steering committee developed, and we've had a few meetings with those people as well. And what we're doing differently this time around is undergoing a process of co-design. So in the pilot study, it was very much James and myself working with the organisations. So we're taking the concepts of compassion-focused therapy to the organisations and developing it. Well, this time we're kind of working and designing the program with the organisations that we're working with. So we had our first co-design workshop in December last year. And what we were able to do in that workshop was define the purpose of the project. So it's to cultivate and enhance self-compassion in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The parameters, so there's 5 of those, and they're set out by the Department of Health in the contract. So that's embodying CFT through the medium of art, ensuring that the program is culturally safe, it's sustainable and handed over to the organisations that we're working with. Evaluation occurs, and our findings are available for national dissemination. So we're actually sharing our learnings with other people as part of the process. So in our first co-design workshop, so the process of co-design is actually having everyone together that's participating in the project. And really what we're aiming to do through that process was looking at resources, who can contribute what, any considerations, training. So it's really kind of a great exercise of bringing everyone together and talking about not just talking about, but really deciding on what's achievable for the project. And one of the actions from the first co-design workshop was a follow-up co-design workshop, which specifically focused on the training aspect of the program. So we just had our second co-design workshop a few weeks ago, and who we had at that workshop was the staff that are actually participating in the training. So they were actually telling us what they would need in order to become facilitators in arts-based compassion-focused therapy. So these are the things that came out of the workshop. So what we kind of determined was that there's 4 levels. So we're starting off at trainee to lead facilitator. We identified the processes of moving through each of those stages, and we've just come up with a preliminary design for the training program. We're still kind of in early phases, but we're looking at hopefully kicking off groups in April, which is really exciting. And yeah, it's a really exciting project to be a part of, and it's nice to see so many faces here that are keen to learn more about it. So we'll finish up with some questions.
Is that better? Yeah. Diane from Southern Cross Uni, teaching the nursing program. Just wanted to ask about the participants and who you're hoping to recruit and how that process, where you're getting them from.
So we're working with 4 Aboriginal health organisations, and the participants are clients of those services. So that's kind of, in the pilot study, it was asking the organisations to identify clients that might be interested in participating, and that would be the same this time around as well.
I'm Liz from Southern Cross University and used to be here. I found that fascinating when you were talking about the reflection, and you know, normally for me I've worked with critical self-reflection in the cultural safety space and for white clinicians working with Indigenous people. What you're doing is really compassionate self-reflection. And I guess I've got no psychology background, but it's fascinating you kind of turn it around. It's not a question, it's just, I love that. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Any other questions? Comments?
Thanks, James and Natalie. Apologies for being late, and you might have covered this already, but I'm interested in what sort of art and the subject of the art that you use in this, because a lot of art is beautiful and pleasant and makes you feel good, but there's also a lot of art that depicts violence and trauma and is intended to be shocking, and I imagine that is that part of is that incorporated into this sort of process, or do you try and avoid that? Do you work with it, or do you try and encourage people to do art that makes people feel good?
So I'll try and answer your question, but feel free to jump in, James. So the art that we did was very much visual art. So James and I introduced the topic of compassion, and then Sunita or Michael, who were the creative facilitators, directed the artwork. So it was very much about using things like collage, cutouts, words, to make a card that represented that aspect or topic that we were covering. So we weren't kind of telling people what they needed to create or how they created it. It was very much, they had a lot of choice around doing that. I will say though, throughout the process of co-design and the feedback that we have received is that there's a strong interest and keenness from the organisations to explore other creative processes, so through dance, music, so there's definitely interest there. Weaving, I think that's kind of definitely interest there in terms of sustainability for the program as well. My understanding is that perhaps for some of the organisations, they have people that are skilled in doing those avenues of art and creative processes. So, and they're culturally relevant as well. So for the first part of this project, what we've been able to negotiate is continuing the visual art through the visual medium, so creating the card concept, and then in the second year of the program actually exploring that more. Do you want to add anything else?
I'll just add a bit there. So what this is very clearly a skills building program. It's not a therapy program. I want to make that absolutely clear. So what we're building is the skills of self-compassion, and we're doing that through the medium of arts. So what you missed earlier, Ross, was us saying that each session is actually focused on one particular aspect of compassion. So it might be, what does a sense of safeness mean to you? What's compassion for others? How do you express that? What about self-compassion, compassion for self? So each session is actually focused on maybe what are the qualities of compassion that for you, what makes sense for you. So we're definitely not looking to represent traumatic episodes in people's lives. We're steering actually right away from that. We're not running a therapy program. We're running a skills building program. What we are suggesting is that for some people it may be really good to be doing therapy alongside of this, and we're talking with the services that at least for some people, certainly for therapy to be absolutely available while they're doing the program. And some people might elect to go there. Yeah.
My name is Charmaine. I'm probably known as Char in the community. I participated in this program with James and Natalie, and it was quite a privilege. And not forgetting Sunita, who is a huge part of this program. I can't make a stick figure sit. And I must say Sunita encouraged us, and creativity did come out, and we were offered different mediums. so we could do collages as such. And it's amazing. It was very a soft approach, and there was trauma, but it wasn't approached in a hard-faced way. And as James has alluded to, there were conversations around those things, but it wasn't like a doom and gloom, which, you know, at times therapy has to go into. So it was quite a soft approach to looking at some of those traumas and how can we forgive ourselves and move on and show compassion to oneself. It's a bit like self-love, and people go, oh, just you got to love yourself, but then how do you do that? You know, because we weren't, I think, regardless of whether Indigenous or not, I don't think we were taught how to self-love. It was easy to love others, but it's how do I love myself? And then as Natalie was saying, you know, it's always self-critical, you know, self-blame and self-doubt. So this gave you permission to forgive yourself and move on, and to be able to nurture yourself. And soothing things, like words like soothing, you know, you can imagine what kind of images come up when you think of those words. And it was quite, yeah, the marriage between art and compassionate focused therapy really did work. And it did talk to the Indigenous people in particular, but I think, as it said, black, white, or brindle, it will talk to anyone. Yeah.
Thank you, Shah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Shah. There was something about doing it this way, doing it through art, that kind of got underneath the normal resistances that people have when they're doing like more, if you like, traditional compassion-focused therapy. When you're doing more traditional compassion-focused therapy, typically you get the yes buts. So you're doing it verbally, you get the yes but, you know, it'll make me, that sounds incredibly self-indulgent, and I'll just, you know, be sitting on the sofa and, you know, eating chocolate and watching TV the whole time, and or it'll make me incredibly weak, and, you know, I won't get anything done. So those are the kind of yes buts that typically come up that you have to kind of get through if you're doing like therapy. But somehow or other, this process undercut that, and there's a very interesting aspect of it that I hope we'll get to sort of explore a little more.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I'd love to see how this group would work with, like, you know, preschool age children, like 4 and 5, so teaching quite early on around doing that, as opposed to, you know, going our life through adulthood and then learning how to reflect back, and then how potentially you would measure that ongoing.
Fascinating.
Oh, I won't use that.
I think there is some, I don't know if there is exactly that research happening, Sasha, but certainly the University of Queensland, so James Kirby is very much looking at self-compassion and parenting and working with young people and children around self-compassion. So watch this space.
And wasn't that group in Newcastle University when we went to Sydney? I think there's a group that we're working with, certainly with young people who are doing the building canoes and stuff.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So,
I'm Alana.
Yeah.
I've been in child protection for nearly 18 years. I'm really curious, and Shah, you might be able to help reflect on an answer, but I'm really curious in relation to working with traumatised adults, but also their traumatised children and maybe their grandchildren, etc. And I see lots of benefits. I work with children using Play-Doh to engage them when they're talking about issues that are really hard for them. We draw pictures, and there's lots of other different tools that we use. But I see that there's a lot of benefit. I probably sits next to what my cousin said here about utilising these sorts of skills-based methods for children, etc. But I'm also interested in how we actually have that conversation when black fellas can't utilise therapy because they see there's shame behind that. And excuse me if my views appear to be racist, but what I don't want to see is white middle class therapies working with black fellas when they're shamed already, and we've got a culturally safe mechanism to get people having dialogue about their issues, but how do we move forward with therapies that work alongside that are culturally safe as well? Otherwise you're sitting there with the art therapies, but you're not moving forward to work with very traumatised people, which is a long process. That's a comment, I'm sorry, but I'm interested.
My age, because you're starting early. And I never knew there was such a thing as self-love, and we were always taught to give to others, you know. And I think, as you've mentioned, Lana, like sand therapy has been out for a long while with children that relate to children. I can't see why that can't be incorporated with compassionate focused therapy. And yeah, you've got to need some psychological thing behind it, otherwise it's just art, you know. So yeah, to teach them how to self-love and how to forgive yourself. We all make mistakes, we learn from it. And I could imagine you're probably dealing with so many traumatized children that have been removed from families. And I would see that as being an excellent idea to be able to bring it into preschools and primary schools, and obviously age appropriate so they actually understand. I can't see why it wouldn't work. Because I felt like a child when I was doing it, and I must say, you know, it was Professor James Bennett-Levy, and he got down and dirty, and he became so approachable, and I've never seen James so comfortable, and he was so engrossed in what he was doing, because I always seen him as this intellectual that couldn't come down to art and working with your hands. So it was really, really, and yeah, it's because I've seen James in other forums where he has to talk in that, you know, intellectual base, if you like. So it was great to see him, and yeah, the participants took to that, and it was regardless of his colour or where he came from. It was more that you're approachable and you are one of us, and it's humanity. You know, it's about how, you know, how we can involve people and to embrace Indigenous stuff, because a young girl came and asked me questions about stereotyping Aboriginal people, and I was saying about the rich culture that they haven't used, which is so sad. You know, LORE, which I'm not even understanding, and the law that we're used to, that's much more complex. And there's so much more we can gain from that, you know, without that. I'm glad you've got away from the CBT. I mean, that's like the holy grail, you know, composite cognitive behaviour therapy. There are other therapies that, yeah, I feel work better at times for different things. So definitely I would advocate for schools, yeah.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to see if Sunita, if it's okay if I put you on the spot, just about whether you have any perspectives of what it was like being a community arts representative like yourself and doing the work that you do, and what it was like participating in this project, and whether there's like transferable learnings to the community work that you do in relation to this as well. And I think it'd be great if you could just share like a brief sentence about what you do as well.
Okay. Hi. So I am Sunita, and I'm part of an organisation that's Lismore-based called Real Artworks. Real Artworks defines itself as a post-disability arts company, which is that a lot of our artists are people who identify as experiencing living with a disability, but we work on the social model of disability, which is it's the barriers that society puts up that allows us, or sometimes doesn't allow us, to do and follow the things that we'd like to do. So we consider ourselves to be socially engaged artists. So that's another form of being an artist. It's someone who's interested in systemic change, it's interested in humanity, it's interested with working with people's narratives. So this is already the background that we come into. I think it's really interesting that one of the revelations that came out of this was that it was great that we were all equal in the room, that facilitators were also vulnerable and also just as vulnerable and just as powerful as anyone else. And that's very much part of the ethos of how Real Artworks artists work. So there was a lot of things that were transferable, and that we did naturally, that we brought as artists into that space. I also think that part of being a socially engaged artist, and where it differs from art therapy, is that we're not about, and don't take this wrong, but the way that I see sometimes art theory is to bring somebody down, to tear them apart so you can build them back up. It's that process. And socially engaged artistic endeavour isn't about creating solutions, it's about creating transparency. It's about allowing to create those questions in the space to reflect, so that the power is still within the individual about where they move forward, but it's about making sure that the supports are there for that person to move forward if they wish to. So a lot of the things that we did, for me it was very exciting to be, and it is exciting to be part of this project. It's exciting for me to see the theory of self-compassion now identified and really articulated so well within the arts. I think that's always been there, but I think now we're really identifying it, you know, and we're moving forward. And I think that the other thing, I guess, is that what I find very exciting about this is that the group become a community. And it's said in a way that because we're all busy, you don't have to be there every week. Obviously, that's great, but you know, we are all human beings and things happen. So it's the kind of flow and ebb where people can go away for 2 weeks and they don't feel embarrassed or shamed or nervous about coming back. What's created at the end is a set of cards this year, and that's also a tool. And so it'll be exciting to see how participants use those cards and health professionals and organisations use those cards as a way to maintaining relationships and discussions with the people that, I mean, they're supporting, I guess, yeah. So I hope that answers some of it. Thank you.
I'm just really interested in knowing what provisions of care, if someone were to come across a traumatic experience or a trigger, and was that something that was culturally specific? Because it sounds like there's been like a higher number of First Nations people engaging in this pilot. So I was just wondering, yeah, what the supervisions were after.
So in terms of, I guess, even prior to participating in the groups, we did do assessments. So we were looking at excluding people that did have complex mental health issues. So anyone that had a psychotic illness or were suicidal weren't able to participate. But in terms of people being triggered, I think that an example of that was when we were discussing identifying people who have been compassionate to in your life. So for a lot of people, it was the way that question was worded that was triggering for them. In our groups that we had Shah, who's a counsellor, and also Dwayne. So they are our support people. So what would happen, and one example of that would be when someone was triggered, they would go out and have a cigarette, and Dwayne or Shah would kind of go out and have a yarn with them. But James and I would also make ourselves available if anyone did need debriefing as well.
We just have time for one more question.
Thanks. Susan from the Buttery. I'm just wondering, so you're going to be co-designing, which is great, and I'm just wondering if services and indeed participants might take part in developing the evaluation framework as well. Is that something you might or have considered of input?
So what we didn't talk about was the other thing that came out of the first co-design workshop was developing the measures. So absolutely, that is part of the process, is to be working with the organisations to develop the measures. Absolutely, very important.
Okay, look, thanks everyone for your engagement, and also if you could, you're welcome to join us for tea and coffee afterwards. I think James and Natalie are going to hang around a little bit, so feel free to stay and have some tea and coffee. if you'd like to just, I guess before we thank James and Natalie, it'd be fantastic to have you come back to the seminar series and present some of the findings as it emerges. So it'd be great to hear about the project as it evolves. But if you could just thank James and Natalie for a fantastic project.
Yeah, well, I'd like to thank Natalie, actually. That was really lovely. That's beautifully presented, though. Thank you. It's great to see Shah here, and Colin from Rekindling, and Sunita, of course, who've all been and continue to be central to the project. Dave, who's been on our advisory committee. Thank you all. I probably missed out several people, but Karen's very much part of our new project, and Maddie was briefly as well. So thank you all, and we look forward to reporting back in about a year's time.